Greetings. I was thinking about making this video prior to Western Pascha, which is to say the feast popularly called Easter in English, which is celebrated by Catholics and many Protestants, which just happened last Sunday. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find the time to do so. However, this is one of those years where Eastern Pascha, i.e. the counterpart feast, which is celebrated by Eastern Orthodox Christians, falls at a later time. So at least I can still get this video out in time for that. In other words, this is currently Holy Week for the Eastern Orthodox Christians. On your screen is the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew in the King James translation. And the 40th verse of that chapter reads as follows. This is Matthew 12:40. Quote, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." End quote. As many have noted, a literal, straightforward reading of that text would seem to be numerically at odds with the traditional Christian belief that Christ's body was placed in the tomb on Friday, just before sundown, or just before the start of the Sabbath, and then he physically rose from the dead the following Sunday morning, or on the first day of the Hebrew week. I'll be referring to that period as the traditional timeline in this video. And for an example of someone noting the apparent difficulties with the traditional timeline, consider the way Ahmed Deedat put it.
This is exactly, I'm reading your Bible word for word, verse for verse. Friday night, he's supposed to be in the grave. Saturday day, he's supposed to be in the grave. Saturday night, he's still supposed to be in the grave. Sunday morning, the first day of the week. Sunday morning, not Monday. Sunday morning, the first day of the week, when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb is empty. So I'm asking, how many days and how many nights? Come, look. It's very simple. Well, by God, no, if your eyes are not, you're not short-sighted. You can see. How many nights and how many days? Huh? 2 nights and a day. Look, Friday night, Saturday day, Saturday night, Sunday morning, he's not there. 2 nights and a day. What did he say? For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. He said 3 and 3, 3 and 3. What we see is 2 and 1. I want to know from you Christians whether this 2 and 1 and 3 is the same.
Now, there are some out there who try to reconcile the New Testament with a literal reading of Matthew 12:40 by scrapping the traditional timeline. Now, the traditional timeline is based on a fairly straightforward reading of the New Testament, but there's some who they believe in the New Testament, but they conclude that the traditional timeline is wrong, and so therefore they come up with alternative interpretations. For example, some will say that the Sabbath that nearly interrupted Christ's execution was not the weekly seventh-day Sabbath, but rather the start of Passover, which is sort of like a Sabbath unto itself, a high Sabbath, a holy convocation, they'll say. And they'll argue based on their interpretation, or at least some of them will argue that based on their interpretation of Daniel 9:27, that Christ actually died and was buried on a Wednesday. Whatever the case, putting that aside, I'm not endorsing that alternative view, but I'm also not casting aspersions on it. Nonetheless, I personally would like to hold to the traditionally understood time frame, which is indeed not literally 3 days and 3 nights. So then the question for someone like me becomes, if one is to hold to the traditional timeline, to the belief that Jesus was buried on Friday and then rose on Sunday, how do they reconcile that? How do we reconcile that with Matthew 12:40? For my part, I would suggest that Jesus' statement may potentially contain within it a colloquialism which is lost on those who are far removed from the time and language in which it was uttered. So, I would begin with this seemingly obvious point, which nonetheless remains worth stating. Jesus was not speaking to 20th and 21st century English speakers. On the contrary, he was speaking to ancient Palestinian Jews in Palestine. The reason why this is worth stating is because it is arguable, in my opinion, that the statement worked within the matrix of an ancient Palestinian Jewish mindset, which a hyperliteral approach to a modern English translation of Matthew 12:40 may miss or lose sight of. This is Talmud Yerushalmi, also known as the Palestinian Talmud, Tractate Shabat 64a. In this brief video, I'd like to propose that the Palestinian Talmud might provide insight into the locutions employed by ancient Jews living in Palestine and the mindset that goes into that. So with that in mind, I'd like to focus on an interesting statement at the bottom of this page of Yerushalmi, of Talmud Yerushalmi. The relevant line reads as follows, quote, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah omer yom ulela ona, umekitzat ona kekula. And the translation of that is, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, a day and a night are an onah, and a small part of an onah is like the entirety of it. Now, I left the word onah untranslated because it's a unit of time, in this case, distinct to the Palestinian Jewish mindset. So let's keep that in mind. Ancient Jews in Palestine had a concept of a unit known as an onah, which comprised a day and a night. And they were willing to treat a small part of such a unit as a whole unit, as a whole, onah. Consider an analogy which might be considered by some to be somewhat timely, as for those of us in the United States, it's currently tax season, or it would be the end of tax season were it not for the current lockdowns. As a longtime resident of New York, I personally have filled out the New York State Tax Form IT-201 many times. And that's the form you see on your screen, and it has a somewhat analogous line. So I'd like to zoom in on question E on the form for 2019. It asks how many days one has spent in New York City, and it has this clarification. Any part of a day spent in New York City is considered a day. In other words, similar to that statement from Talmud Yerushalmi, that which we just looked at, even the smallest part of a day in New York City is to be counted as an entire day when filling out this form. So for a quick hypothetical example, if you were in New York City from 11 p.m. on Friday until 1 a.m. on Sunday, you would have only been in the city for 26 hours. And yet, for the sake of this form, you would treat those 26 hours as constituting 3 days. So with that in mind, let's return to the traditional timeline for Christ's period in the tomb. If he was buried towards the end of the 6th day of the Hebrew week, just before the start of the Sabbath, that would be a small part of one onah. Then the entirety of the Sabbath would constitute a second onah. And finally, if he was in the tomb until the morning of the first day of the Hebrew week, that would encompass part of a third onah. Keeping that in mind, we can now lay out an argument which employs the relevant Palestinian Jewish line of thought to reconcile Matthew 12:40 with the traditional timeline for Christ's period in the tomb. Jesus' time in the tomb spanned 3 onot. One onah is a day and a night. Therefore, Jesus' time in the tomb spanned 3 units of a day and a night, or 3 days and 3 nights. Now, at this point, I can appreciate that some might feel that a bit of sleight of hand was employed, but that's only if we insist on a hyperliteral reading of the statement in Matthew 12:40 while ignoring the ancient Palestinian Jewish line of thought, which permits one to treat a part of an onah as an entire onah. And this is where the point I made earlier about Jesus speaking to ancient Palestinian Jews and not modern English speakers comes into play. And we can consider yet another analogy in this regard, which might be helpful. Imagine 2 Americans are having a conversation in which one of them asks, "Did you run the entire marathon?" Then imagine the other American replies, "I ran the whole 9 yards." In the modern English spoken by Americans, the phrase, quote, "the whole 9 yards," end quote, is not necessarily referring to a literal distance of 9 yards. By the way, for those of you on the metric system, a yard is equal to slightly over 9/10 of a meter. So 9 yards, a literal 9 yards would be slightly over 8 meters in length. Now, it would be a mistake to think that statement above at the top of your screen means that for modern Americans, a marathon was only 9 yards long. In reality, the span of a marathon has a distance of over 46,000 yards. But imagine if the hypothetical exchange at the top of your screen was recorded, transcribed in a language other than English, and then somewhere between a millennium and a half to 2 millennia later, it was translated into a third language. If someone in a completely different culture and a completely different linguistic paradigm was reading that exchange, that meta-translation, that translation of a translation, they might lose sight of the modern American English colloquialism being employed, and they might make the mistake of interpreting that statement literally. Well, so too, in the case of trying to reconcile Matthew 12:40 with the traditional timeline for Jesus' period in the tomb, I would submit that the time difference and the linguistic differences between modern-day English readers and Christ's statement may result in one missing the background of the mindset of ancient Jews in Palestine, which might provide grounds for how the traditional timeline could satisfy the phrase, quote, 3 days and 3 nights, or, 3 onot. On that note, I'll close here. I want to wish a belated Happy Easter to those who celebrated last Sunday, and wish a forthcoming Happy Pascha to those who are celebrating the Feast of the Resurrection on this coming Sunday. As always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.
المسيح قام من بين الأموات ووطئ الموت بالموت ووهب الحياة للذين في القبور. Χριστός ανέστη επνεκρόν θανάτων βατήσας και της εν τη μνήμας η ζωή ευχαρισάμενο.